The first snow of Christmas in Pine Haven fell like a veil of forgetfulness over the Hargrove family's troubles. To an outsider, the scene in the wooden house by the lake would be a perfect Christmas painting. Smoke rising from the chimney, multicolored lights twinkling against the immaculate white, and inside, the decorated tree in the corner of the living room, a majestic pine that smelled of resin and nostalgia. But for Sarah Hargrove, each twinkling light was a blink of anxiety. She watched the snow fall beyond the fogged window, feeling the silent weight of the new house, the new city, the Christmas they were trying to force to be perfect. The divorce earlier in the year had left scars on everyone, and this season was Mark, her ex-husband, a desperate attempt to piece together what remained of their family. He was in the kitchen, trying to follow a gingerbread cookie recipe with Lily, his 10-year-old daughter. The burnt smell was too obvious a metaphor for Sarah's taste. "It's burning, Daddy." Lily's voice was a high-pitched sound of genuine amusement, a rare sound in recent months. "It's the charred touch, darling." "All trendy," Mark replied, and Sarah heard the smile in his voice. She frowned. Was it that easy for him? To erase a year of yelling and slamming doors with flashing lights and bad cookies? That's when she noticed the first anomaly. The Christmas tree lights, a new and expensive set Mark had bought for the occasion, blinked in unison. It wasn't the usual chaotic and cheerful twinkling. It was a single, long pause of darkness, followed by a simultaneous relighting, like a slow, deep breath. The color changed slightly too, from a warm white to a glacial bluish white that for a second made Sarah's skin crawl. She blinked, and the lights returned to normal. "Nervousness," she whispered to herself, turning her gaze back to the snow. Later, during dinner, it was Mark's turn to notice something. He was hanging a stocking on the fireplace for Lily. A fake, electric fireplace with orange LED flames. "Strange," he commented, stopping in front of the small pile of presents that was already under the tree. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked without much interest. "You have an extra gift here. A small one, wrapped in different paper." Sarah approached. He was right. Among the packages with reindeer and Santa Claus prints, there was a small cube, perfectly wrapped in deep, opaque, almost black-red wrapping paper. The ribbon was dark green satin, tied in a bow so perfect it looked machine-made. There was no label. "Did you buy it?" Mark asked Sarah. "Me? No. I thought you had bought something for Lily, a surprise." Mark shook his head, a slight discomfort crossing his face. "No, it must be from the real estate agency then. A welcome gift. Small towns are like that." The explanation was reasonable, but it didn't quite fit. The paper was strangely cold to the touch, and the red was too intense, disturbing. The night progressed with more of these small cuts in reality. Lily, sipping her hot chocolate, frowned and said, "It tastes like ash, Mom." Sarah tasted hers. It was perfect, sweet, and creamy. When she put on some Christmas music on the smart speaker, the chorus of "Silent Night" briefly sounded distorted, the voices slurring and becoming guttural before returning to normal. Mark attributed it to a bad Wi-Fi connection. Sarah began to feel a pressure behind her eyes, a subtle headache that throbbed in time with the twinkling lights of the tree. The last straw was the snowman. Lily had built it in front of the house that afternoon, a classic snowman, with an old hat and scarf, a carrot nose, and coal buttons for eyes and mouth. Before going to bed, she looked out the window and groaned. "What, dear?" Sarah asked, approaching. "The snowman." "He's looking at me." Sarah looked. There was the snowman, harmless in the porch light. "He's not looking at anything, Lily. He's facing the street." "Not the eyes," Lily whispered, her face pale. "The mouth." Sarah strained her eyes. The coal buttons that formed the mouth were no longer a simple three-point smile. They had rearranged themselves. Now they were a straight, horizontal line, a thin, severe cut in the white face. And although logic told Sarah it was just the wind or the melting, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was an expression of pure, unwavering observation. The snowman was no longer smiling. It was judging. They tucked Lily into bed, promising the snowman would be fixed by morning. The child fell asleep, clutching a teddy bear, her face etched with a worry unbecoming of her age. In the living room, the silence was heavy. The bluish light from the tree seemed to swallow the shadows instead of creating them. "We need to talk about this," Sarah said, her voice sounding unusually loud in the room. "Talk about what?" Mark replied, avoiding her gaze. "About a melting snowman? About a complimentary gift? Sarah, you're looking for trouble where there isn't any. You always do that." The comment was like a stab in the back. They argued in low, cutting voices about the divorce, about the move, about the palpable unhappiness that seemed to seep into the house, colder than the winter wind outside. The argument resolved nothing. It only amplified the emptiness between them. Exhausted, Sarah retired to the guest room. Mark stayed in the living room trying to watch a Christmas comedy film, the sound low, his attention anywhere but on the screen. That's when he heard it. A sound coming from under the tree, a dry, rough noise, like fingernails or something harder scratching the wooden floorboards. He froze, the TV remote languishing in his hand. The sound stopped. He released the breath he hadn't realized he was holding, and then it started again. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Slowly, Mark stood up. The light from the tree and the television were the only sources of illumination, casting sickly, dancing shadows across the walls. He knelt, his heart pounding in his chest, and stared into the dark space beneath the lower branches of the pine tree. There it was, the small dark red gift, and he was moving. A subtle, almost imperceptible tremor shook the package. A scratching sound came from inside. Scratch, scratch, pause, scratch. Hesitantly, overcome by a mixture of fear and macabre curiosity, Mark reached out. His fingers trembled. The paper was icy, like the ice of a frozen lake. He picked up the gift. It was heavier than it looked. The scratching stopped immediately. Sitting on the floor, under the ghostly light of the Christmas tree, Mark Hargrove tugged at the green satin ribbon. It unraveled with a sigh. He tore the opaque paper, his hands clumsy with haste and fear. Inside, there was no box. There was a dark wooden object, hand-carved. He picked it up and brought it into the light. It was a small figure, a man with a cloak and a tall hat. The carving was primitive, crude, but the details of the face were too sharp. The mouth was wide open in a silent scream, and where the eyes should have been, there were only two empty, deep holes. At the base of the figure, a word was scratched as if made with a knife. Necked. A chill ran down Mark's spine. He didn't know what it meant, but the object emanated a palpable malevolence, a mistaken antiquity. From upstairs, on the upper floor, a sharp, terrified scream cut through the silence of the house. Ira Lilly. Mark dropped the wooden figure as if it had burned his hand and ran upstairs, his blood cold. He broke down the door to her room. The child was sitting on the bed, her face flooded with tears, pointing towards the window. The snowman. "Daddy," she cried, sobbing. "He's on the porch. He's looking at me." Mark ran to the window, his pale, frightened reflection hurtling out against the darkness outside. The porch was empty. The snowman was no longer in the garden. He was nowhere to be found. The only thing left where he had been were two deep furrows in the snow, as if something heavy had been dragged away, toward the dark forest that bordered the lake, and in the fresh, pristine snow of the balcony directly in front of Lily's room. There was a single pair of footprints. They were large, heavy footprints, and they ended not in the soles of boots, but in cloven hooves. Lily's scream echoed through the house like the breaking of glass in the silence of the night. Sarah emerged from the guest room door, her face pale and disoriented, her eyes meeting Mark's in the dark hallway. What was that? What happened? "Lily!" Mark gasped, rushing to his daughter's room. The girl was huddled in the corner of the bed, her knees pulled against her chest, the teddy bear crushed against her face. Her sobs were muffled and convulsive. He was there, on the balcony, looking at me. Sarah came over to Mark and wrapped Lily in her arms, casting an accusing glance over her shoulder. "What's she talking about, Mark? What did you see?" "Nothing," he replied, his voice trembling. "There was no one there, just footprints." He didn't mention the hooves, not yet. The image was burned into his retina. but giving them a voice seemed to grant them a reality he wasn't prepared to accept. Sarah went to the window and looked out at the empty balcony. The snow continued to fall softly, slowly erasing the disturbing marks. She saw the furrows in the garden where the snowman had been and the emptiness that followed. A chill that had nothing to do with the cold ran down her spine. She pulled the curtain shut. "It was a nightmare, darling," Sarah whispered, stroking Lily's hair. "Just a nightmare. The snowman probably fell over in the wind." "He didn't fall," Lily sobbed, her voice a thread of terror. "He walked. I saw him." They spent the next hour calming the child, carrying her to her bed, checking the closet and under the bed with a flashlight, reenacting the comforting parental ritual to ward off imaginary monsters. But the fear in the air was thick and real. Finally, Lily fell asleep, exhausted by the panic, her fingers still tightly intertwined on the teddy bear. In the living room, the atmosphere was heavy. The Christmas tree now seemed like an intruder, its flickering light taking on a sinister quality. "Hoof tracks, Mark," Sarah whispered furiously, her arms crossed. "What's going on?" He showed her the wooden figure that had fallen to the floor. He had left it there, reluctant to touch it again. Sarah picked it up cautiously. At the contact with the cold wood, she shuddered. "Connect?" She read, turning the figure in her hands over. "What does that mean?" "I don't know," Mark admitted, running his fingers through his hair. "It seems old-fashioned and wrong." It was then that the lights on the tree flickered again in that slow, breathing rhythm. Darkness, then the white, bluish light. This time, it was undeniable. Sarah froze, her eyes fixed on the tree. "Did you see?" she whispered. Mark simply nodded, his mouth dry. And then, the sound began. It wasn't loud. It was a whisper coming from the tree itself, a whisper of several voices, overlapping, hissing and dry like the rustling of dead leaves. It wasn't possible to distinguish words, only a cacophony of whispers that seeped into the room, filling the spaces between the furniture, echoing inside their heads. It smelled of pine, yes, but also of damp earth and something rotting deep underground. Sarah dropped the wooden figure onto the carpet. It rolled and stopped in front of them, the empty eye holes seeming to accuse. "Turn it off," Sarah ordered, her voice trembling. Mark, moving like a sleepwalker, went to the socket and pulled the plug from the tree. The lights went out. The whispers stopped. The silence that followed was deep and heavy. The only light came from the fake fireplace, its LED flames now looking weak and useless. "Good heavens," Mark breathed, leaning against the wall. They spent the rest of the night awake, sitting in the kitchen under the harsh fluorescent light, drinking bitter coffee without saying a word. The house, once a sanctuary against the blizzard, now seemed like a trap. Every creak of the wood, every blow of the wind against the windows made them fidget. Christmas had turned against them. The next morning, the snow had stopped, and a pale, wintry sun illuminated the landscape. The normalcy of the day brought a fragile veneer of sanity. The footprints on the porch had been completely covered. Mark, determined to regain control, announced that he would go to town to buy a new roll of lights and ask some questions. Pinehaven was a small town, the kind where everyone knew everyone. The hardware store, Harrison's Everything Store, was the center of gossip. Old Tom Harrison, a man with a face wrinkled like a dried apple, was behind the counter. "Christmas lights, huh?" Tom said as Mark picked out a basic roll of warm white lights. "Yours burned out." "That's strange. These new sets usually last." "They didn't exactly burn," Mark said hesitantly. "They changed." Tom raised a gray eyebrow. Mark continued, choosing his words carefully. "And speaking of which, did you or someone from the real estate agency leave a welcome gift for us?" "A small, dark red package?" Tom's face lost some of its cordiality. "A welcome gift? No, sir. The real estate agency doesn't do that. And nobody else around here either. We're not that kind of people." He frowned. "Why? Did you receive something?" "It's... Never mind," Mark said quickly, feeling foolish. "Probably a misunderstanding." He paid for the lights and was turning to leave when one last question came to his lips. "Oh, and Mr. Harrison, have you ever heard of the word connect?" The effect was instantaneous. Blood drained from Tom's face. His hands, which were adjusting some screws, stopped. "Where did you hear that word?" The old man's voice was rough and urgent. "I found it. Carved into something." Tom looked into Mark's eyes, and the fear Mark saw there was genuine and ancient. "Listen to me, Mr. Hargrove. There are old stories in this town. Stories people don't tell anymore. About things that came before us before Christmas as we know it. Things that hide under the snow and whisper through the pines." He leaned forward, his whisper smelling of tobacco and menthol. "The Necht is one of them. It's a warning. It means bound or tied. They say it's the name they gave to whatever bound the evil thing here long ago." "What is it?" Mark asked, his heart pounding. "The ancients didn't call her Santa Claus," Tom whispered, his eyes dark. "They called her Krampus, the old man of ice, and he doesn't give presents. He takes them. He comes for those who are disconnected, broken families. He feeds on unhappiness." He stepped back, his face hardened. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to close up." Mark left the store, his mind spinning. Krampus, Necht, broken families. It was a legend, a dark fairy tale, but it fit perfectly into his shattered reality. As he drove back to his house by the lake, he passed the town cemetery, and there, near the fence under the shade of a large pine tree, he saw it. An ancient grave of dark stone marked with a single word worn by time, but still legible: Necht. He stepped on the gas, his stomach churning. At home, Sarah was trying to maintain normalcy, wrapping the old garland around the stairs. Lily was sitting in the living room coloring, but she barely looked out the window. "So?" Sarah asked, reading the distress on Mark's face. He told her about Tom Harrison and the legend. "About the grave," Sarah laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Krampus. Seriously, Mark? Now we're believing in fairy tales to scare children. And the lights, Sarah. The whispers. The snowman. The wooden figure." He pointed to the small statue, which was now on the mantelpiece, its empty eyes staring around the room. "Coincidences. Suggestion. This house is old. The wind makes strange noises. And Lily had a nightmare because we're all stressed out." Sarah's voice was becoming shrill. This was her defense, her anchor in reality: denial. To prove her point, she picked up the new lights Mark had bought. "Let's fix this tree and put an end to this madness." She unwound the new string of lights and, determined, began to remove the old, defective lights from the tree. She pulled the first strand, and a branch snapped. A handful of pine needles fell, brown and dry, even though the tree was fresh. She ignored it. She pulled another strand. More needles fell. And then, when she pulled a thread deeply embedded in the inner branches, her hand touched something that wasn't wood or light. It was soft, squishy. She pulled her hand back with a little squeal. Caught in the branches, almost completely hidden, was the snowman's carrot nose. It was withered and black, and the tip was stained with a dark, sticky red that looked horribly like blood. From within the densest branches of the tree, a single whisper emerged, clear and icy, straight to her ear. It was a voice she recognized, a voice she hadn't heard since she was a child, the voice of her own grandmother, now deceased, whispering a single word: "Sarah." She screamed and stumbled backward, knocking over a side table. A Christmas ornament fell and shattered on the wooden floor, but instead of shards, a dark, coagulated liquid gushed out, smelling of scrap metal and rot. Lily, in the room, started crying again. Mark ran to Sarah, who was huddled on the ground, staring at the tree with indescribable horror. The Christmas tree now lay bare on a branch, its brown needles drooping around its base like a pile of dry bones. And from the depths of its bare branches, the whispers began again, louder this time. A symphony of dry, angry voices, whispering not indistinct words anymore, but their names: Mark, Sarah, Lily, and then the new lights that Sarah had left on the sofa, still in the box, still plugged in, turned on by themselves. They didn't flicker. They shone with that same bluish, icy white, illuminating the room with the light of a dead star. The wooden figure on the fireplace, necked, began to vibrate, tapping against the wood of the fake fireplace. Tap, 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 and from outside, coming from the forest by the lake, a new sound joined the chorus of horrors. It was not a whisper nor a scratch. It was the distant yet unmistakable sound of a single bell tolling. A solitary, deep and mournful sound that heralded neither joy nor celebration. It sounded like a lament and like a call. The bell wouldn't stop ringing. Its mournful tolling was like an icy needle piercing the ears of the Hargrove family, penetrating the wooden walls of the house, more effective than the cold of the blizzard. Dong, dong, dong. A slow, irregular rhythm, like a dying heart beating in the center of the dark forest. Inside the house, the chaos had solidified into a paralyzing terror. Sarah was still huddled on the floor, staring at the now dead, whispering Christmas tree. Mark had run to the fireplace and thrown the wooden, necked figure into the fake fireplace, locking it behind the glass where it continued to vibrate, banging against the doorway with an insistent click, click, click. The new lights, still in their box, cast their spectral light, transforming each shadow into an elongated menace. Lily wept silently on the sofa, her face buried in a cushion. "We have to get out of here," Mark said, his voice rough. He was already grabbing his car keys from the coffee table. "Now, we're going to town, to a hotel." Sarah shook her head slowly, her eyes still fixed on the tree. What if it's with us? What the old man said. He feeds on unhappiness. What if it's with us, not with the house? It's not us, Sarah. It's a gas leak, something? Mass hallucinations? It was Mark's last weak anchor of rationality, and he was clinging to it tooth and nail. He pulled Sarah up. She was limp, shocked. He dragged her to the sofa and picked Lily up in his arms. The little girl was light and trembling like a bird. "Let's go," he ordered, heading towards the garage door. The garage was cold and dark. The smell of gasoline and oil was comfortingly mundane. Mark pressed the door opener button. The engine groaned, but the door didn't budge. He pressed it again. Nothing. "Shit," he breathed, running to the front door. The metal doorknob was so cold it burned the palm of his hand. He pulled. The door wouldn't budge. He pulled harder, slamming his shoulder against it. It was as if it were sealed shut. Through the window beside the door, he could see the pristine snow and their car, an object of impossible freedom just 10 meters away. The windows. He grabbed a heavy candlestick from the dining table and, with a muffled cry of anger and fear, struck the living room window. The chandelier clinked with a dull metallic sound. The window didn't break. It didn't even crack. Mark looked closer. The surface of the glass wasn't covered in ice on the outside. It was frozen inside with a pattern of crystals so dense and thick they looked like steel. He touched the glass. It was as solid as stone. They were locked up, imprisoned. The bell outside stopped suddenly. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the sound. It was a heavy, expectant silence, like the held breath of a predator just before attacking. And then, the music started. Coming from the house's sound system, the same smart speaker that had played a distorted version of Silent Night, a song began to play. It was Jingle Bells, but I was wrong. The notes were drawn out, dissonant, as if played on a piano with rotten keys. And instead of cheerful voices, a chorus of harsh whispers sang the lyrics, replacing fun with frightened and sledding with rotting in the snow. Jingle bells, jingle all the way. Oh, what fear it is to ride in a hearse this day. Hey! Lily screamed and covered her ears. Sarah finally seemed to come out of her shock, her face contorting in pure terror. "Turn it off! Turn it off!" she yelled. Mark ran to the speaker and unplugged it. The music continued, a little quieter but still coming from the same place, as if it were now permeated in the very air. That's when the Christmas lights on the house next door, the only other house visible through the forest, about 200 meters away, suddenly lit up. The Henderson family, a large and cheerful family, had an extravagant decoration: illuminated angels, reindeer, an inflatable Santa Claus. And then, one by one, The lights began to transform. The white angels bent forward, their silent trumpets now pointing to the ground, and their lights changed from a celestial white to a bloody red. The reindeer, previously in a leaping position, tilted their heads, and their bright snouts became sickly green points of light. The inflatable Santa Claus, normally chubby and smiling, began to slowly deflate. His face drooped, his eyes darkened, and his raised arm, which had once waved, twisted back at an impossible angle, his finger pointing directly at the Hargrove house. It was a message. They were the target. Lily, crying, pointed to the kitchen window. "Mommy!" In the snow of the side garden, where before there was only the mark of the missing snowman, new shapes had emerged. They weren't footprints. They were symbols, drawn in the snow as if something had dragged an icy finger. They formed a series of interconnected circles, like a chain, and inside each circle, a word was scratched. Loneliness, anger, despair, the emotions that had consumed the Hargrove family throughout the year. Back in the room, the whispers in the dead tree grew more urgent, overpowering the ghostly music. They were no longer just whispering names. They were whispering phrases a divided family cannot stand. The old man likes his pain. It's so sweet. He's coming to get what's his. Sarah, trembling, went to the fake fireplace and looked at the wooden figure banging. "What does he want?" She shouted at the whispers. "What does he want from us?" The whispers stopped for a moment. Then a single voice, clear and childlike, Lily's voice but coming from the tree, whispered, "The first gift." Mark and Sarah exchanged glances. The first gift. The dark red package. Where is it? Mark asked, scanning the room with his eyes. It wasn't under the tree. Sarah remembered dropping it when she pulled the carrot nose. She knelt down, searching the carpet near the overturned side table. Her fingers touched something cold and metallic. It was the broken Christmas ball, or what was left of it. The shattered glass ornament was empty now. The dark liquid had dried, leaving behind only a sticky residue and a sickly smell. And under the table, half hidden beneath the edge of the carpet, was the small cube of dark red wrapping paper. It looked intact. The green ribbon was still perfectly tied. Mark picked it up. It was even heavier than he remembered, and the cold emanating from it was profound. "What do we do with him?" Sarah asked, her voice a whisper. The whispers from the tree answered in unison. "Abram. Burn them. Hide them." Different voices, conflicting advice, hissing over each other. The bell in the forest began to ring again, but now faster, more urgently. Dong 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 dong. Lily stood up from the sofa and walked over to them, her eyes red from crying, but now with a strange spark of determination. "He's angry," she said simply. "Because we're still together." The observation hung in the air, laden with meaning. Their unhappiness was the invitation, but their lingering bond, their love, shaken but not broken, for their daughter, was a resistance. Mark looked at the gift in his hands, then at Sarah. For the first time in months they were in sync, united not by love, but by fear and a primal need to protect their daughter. "We're not going to open it," Mark said, his voice firm. "No," Sarah agreed, her face pale but determined. That's when the cellar door, which was in the hallway near the kitchen and always creaked, opened by itself with a long, agonizing creak. Inside it was absolute darkness, and from that darkness a smell escaped, the smell of wet earth, of old, frozen meat, and of rotting holly. And then something came out. It wasn't a figure, it wasn't an entity. It was cold itself, taking shape. A creeping, icy mist, so dense it seemed solid, flowed out of the cellar like water. It didn't dissipate. It creeped across the wooden floor, engulfing the hallway. Wherever it touched, a thick white frost instantly sprouted, and the whispers of the tree became shrill, euphoric cries. The icy mist flowed toward them, and at its center, shapes began to solidify. Long, bony fingers made of ice and shadow gripped the ground. The accompanying sound was that of thousands of ice needles shattering, a crackling and popping that filled their heads. It was him, the old man of ice, Krampus. He was coming to collect his gift. Acting on instinct, Mark pushed Sarah and Lily back toward the locked door. He held the dark red gift like a useless weapon. The icy fingers reached for the living room carpet, and the fabric froze and shattered beneath her touch. The mist rose, beginning to form the silhouette of a tall, thin body, with twisted antlers that were not reindeer but something ancient and malevolent. Sprouting from a head that still had no face, only a swirling, hungry darkness. He extended an icy hand, not to Mark, but to Lily. Sarah screamed and pulled her daughter back. Without thinking, in a final act of desperation, Mark shouted, "Take it! Just take it and go away," and he threw the dark red gift directly into the heart of the icy fog that was forming. Time stood still. The gift vanished into the swirling darkness. The icy fog froze in place. The whispers stopped. The bells stopped. For an eternity, nothing happened. Then, a sound filled the silence. It was low, guttural, and vibrant. It wasn't a bell. It was laughter. A deep, satisfied laugh that came from the thing in the room, a sound that cracked the ice and promised a pain far worse than any nightmare they could imagine. The icy mist receded, flowing back into the cellar, and the door slammed shut on its own with a final bang. They stood alone in the devastated room, breathless, the spectral light of the new lights still gleaming. The gift had vanished. They had given it to him. And in the center of the carpet, where the icy mist had been, a single word was burned into the wood, smoking slightly. Thanks. The first offer had been accepted. The pact had begun, and the worst was yet to come. The laughter echoed in the silent room for a long time after the cellar door slammed shut. It wasn't a sound that existed merely in the air, it vibrated in the bones, in the teeth, a subterranean rumble of satisfied hunger that chilled the blood more effectively than any winter wind. The word, "thank you," burned into the oak floor, smoldered, softly, exhaling a sweet, nauseating odor of roast meat and burnt pine. Mark, Sarah, and Lily remained leaning against the front door, motionless. The momentary unity that terror had granted them dissolved, leaving behind a trembling emptiness. They had done something irrevocable. They had given a gift to the nightmare. What have we done?" Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse from shouting. Mark didn't answer. He stared at the closed cellar door. The brass doorknob was now covered in a thick layer of white frost, and thin streaks of ice radiated from the frame, like poisonous roots spreading across the wall. Lily was the first to move. She broke free from her mother's loose embrace and walked, with the wavering determination of a sleepwalker, to the center of the room. She knelt before the burned word, but did not touch it. Instead, her small finger pointed to the edge of the mark. "Mom! Dad!" They approached reluctantly. Around the word, "thank you," thin lines were scratched into the floor. They were primitive scenes, engraved with a claw or a glowing point. One showed 3 wooden figures, 2 large, 1 small, inside a house. From outside the house, a larger figure with horns extended a hand. In the next scene, one of the large figures had its back to the others. In the last, the small figure was being pulled toward the horned creature. It was a story. Her story. The divorce, the unhappiness, and the final threat to Lily. "He didn't leave," Lily said, her voice incredibly calm. "He just went to get the present." As if his words were a signal, the house's sound system spat out a final gasp of static and then fell into total silence. The ghostly music had ceased. The whispers in the dead tree had quieted. The wooden figure in the fake fireplace stopped vibrating. The silence was absolute, broken only by the muffled sound of his own panting breath. Peace was bait, and they were the hungry fish. The snow began to fall again outside, thick and heavy, covering the windows as if they were being buried alive. Night fell, a premature darkness swallowing the day. They dared not return to their rooms. They huddled in the living room, dragging, mattresses and blankets, lighting every candle they could find. The flickering light of the flames danced on the walls, creating shadows that twisted and stretched disturbingly. The electric light seemed profane now, a pale imitation of the sun they could no longer see. Mark tried his cell phone. No signal. The screen flickered once. An image of a bearded, stern face with goat horns carved in dark wood before going blank and not turning on again. It was Sarah who noticed the first physical change in the house. She was leaning against the wall, near the fireplace trying to warm herself with a blanket, when she felt dampness on her back. She quickly moved away. The wallpaper, a discrete pattern of vertical stripes, was soaked in a spot the size of a hand. It wasn't water. It was a sticky, dark sap that slowly seeped down the wall and smelled like a Christmas tree rotting from the inside. Hours dragged on. Fear was a constant companion, a metallic taste in his mouth. Hunger and thirst began to gnaw at his insides, but the idea of going to the kitchen, of leaving the group, was unthinkable. Around what they thought was midnight, the sound began. It came from the kitchen, a damp, heavy sound. Schlump, schlump, schlump. It was as if something large and wet was being dragged across the tiled floor. Lily snuggled against Sarah, who hugged her tightly, her wide eyes fixed on the kitchen doorway. Schlump, schlump, and a new sound joined it. A soft, metallic tinkling, like that of small bells. The smell reached them first, the same sweet, rotten smell of sap on the wall, mixed with the pungent odor of animal sweat and the rust of blood. Schlump, tinkle, schlump, tinkle. A silhouette formed in the dark entrance to the kitchen. It wasn't the icy, shapeless mist of the wine cellar. It was solid, tangible. He was tall, his twisted horns, necrotic, ice-covered tree branches, scraping against the doorframe. His body was a macabre parody of Santa Claus. He wore a thick, heavy cloak, made not of velvet but of dark moss and black hide taken from a nameless creature. The hide was fastened with bony pins and patched together with spiderwebs as thick as rope. Around his waist, a belt of rusty bells and small bones jingled with every movement. His face was the emptiness they had felt before, now filled. His beard was not of white hair, but of frozen roots and dead pine needles, soaked in frost. And where his eyes should have been, two black, gleaming acorns like living coal reflected the candlelight with an ancient and cruel intelligence. His mouth was a dark, damp slit from which an icy breath escaped in clouds. He stopped in the doorway, his body blocking the passage. His coal-black eyes moved from Mark to Sarah and landed on Lily. The slit in his mouth curved upward, very slowly, in something that wasn't a smile but the stretching of a wound. He was Krampus, the old man of ice, and he was in his house. He took a step into the room. Schlump. The kitchen tile behind him was stained with a sticky black dampness. Mark stood up, placing himself in front of Sarah and Lily, his body trembling uncontrollably. He had no weapon, no plan, just an animal instinct to protect his offspring. The creature ignored him. Its arm, long and ending in sharp branching fingers, emerged from the folds of its cloak. In its claw, it held a bag. It wasn't a velvet toy bag. It was made of a hide similar to its cloak, and it was heavy and damp, dripping onto the carpet. Whatever was inside moved, creating bumps against the material. Krampus stopped in the center of the room, his eyes fixed on the word burned into the floor. He tilted his head, and a sound escaped his throat, a low creak, like ice crushing under a tremendous weight. Then he turned to them. He extended the hand holding the bag, not as an offering, but as a demand. A gift had been given. Now it was time for the exchange. "What do you want?" Mark shouted, his voice shrill with panic. "We already gave you the gift." The coal-black eyes blinked slowly. The creature pointed a claw at the sack, then at them, and then at the door. The message was clear. Someone had to go with him. Someone had to be put in the sack. Sarah groaned, pulling Lily further back against the wall. Krampus let out a sound that might have been a sigh, a sound of infinite disappointment. He lowered the sack, which landed on the ground with a damp thud. Then he turned and walked slowly toward the dead Christmas tree. He ran a claw over the bare branches, and a shudder ran through the tree, as if it were feeling pleasure. He turned around again, and this time, his eyes weren't on Lily. They were on Sarah. He pointed at her, and then he pointed to the photograph on the fireplace. The last photo of the whole family taken the previous Christmas, everyone smiling, a lie frozen in time. He pointed to Sarah's face in the photo, then to Mark's face, and then made a tearing gesture. He pointed to Sarah again, and then to the bag on the floor. The message was more complex now, but still clear. Their unhappiness drew him in. The anger, the loneliness, the despair. Sarah, with her cutting denial. Mark, with his impotent rage. They were the heart of the party. And he wanted the split to be consummated. He wanted one of them to choose to separate, for one of them to betray the other. He didn't just want to take Lily. He wanted them to give him Lily, or maybe each other. He wanted the family to fall apart of its own accord. The bag on the floor trembled, as if anxious. Krampus remained there, a nightmarish statue, waiting. The final gift, the choice that would break the last thread that bound them. The clock on the wall, which hadn't worked for hours, suddenly began to chime. Not 12 chimes, 13, each louder and more distorted than the last, a sound of screeching metal that filled the room to its very core. He was waiting for her answer. The 13th chime of the clock echoed in the room like the sound of a coffin being closed. The last note distorted into a metallic groan before the second hand suddenly chipped from the dial and fell to the floor with a final clink. The silence that followed was worse. It was Krampus's silence, a cold, expectant pause that weighed more than the snow on the roof. His coal-black eyes, motionless, burned Sarah. The bony claw still pointed at her, then at the skin sack on the floor, which pulsed softly with a breath that wasn't its own. Mark felt his legs tremble. The choice was a trap of sharp blades. Hand over Lily? Impossible. Hand over Sarah? The thought was a bolt of shame and horror that shot through him. But a deep, cowardly instinct whispered, "She left you. She's the reason we're here. Maybe he only wants one. Maybe, if he takes one, he'll leave the others alone." He swallowed hard, and the sound seemed too loud in the stillness. Sarah, however, did not look at Mark. Her face, pale and stained with tears, hardened. The fear hadn't gone away, but it had been overcome by something fiercer, maternal instinct, stripped of all denial and resentment. She saw the claw pointed at her, saw the bag, and understood the perverse game. He wanted her to sacrifice herself, or worse, to beg Mark to save her, tearing apart what remained of them. She released the arms that were protecting Lily and stood up. Her knees trembled, but her voice, when it came out, was surprisingly firm. "No," she said. The word hung in the air, small and defiant against the silent mass of the creature. Krampus didn't move. The damp crack of his mouth seemed to narrow slightly. "No," Sarah repeated more forcefully. "You're not taking my daughter. And you're not making us choose." She stepped forward, placing herself directly between the creature and Lily. It was an act of courage so pure and foolish that it took Mark's breath away. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a sound began to emanate from Krampus. A low, hoarse sound, like stones rubbing against each other on the bottom of a frozen river. It was laughter, laughter of genuine amusement. He was having fun, his arm retracted. He didn't need them to choose. He could simply take it. He took a heavy step toward her. Schlump. It was Mark who broke. The laughter, the closeness, the sight of Sarah so vulnerable and determined, something snapped inside him. The anger, the helplessness, the fear, all merged into a single blind impulse. With a hoarse cry, he grabbed the heavy candelabra he had used in the window and ran toward the creature. "Mark, no!" Sarah shouted. He ignored it. He picked up the candelabra and swung it with all his might against the side of Krampus's head. The impact was like striking a petrified tree. An agonizing shock coursed through Mark's arms. The candelabra flew from his numb hands and rolled across the floor. Krampus didn't even flinch at the blow. His coal-black eyes slowly shifted from Sarah to Mark. The amusement in his gaze was palpable. He moved his hand too quickly to be seen. A black, forked tongue, like a snake's, emerged from the slit in his mouth and licked the air, passing inches from Mark's face. It didn't touch him, but an instant frost burned his skin, leaving a red, icy mark on his cheek. The smell emanating from it was of millennia of decay. Mark fell to his knees, panting, nauseated by the smell and the icy pain. Krampus ignored him. The challenge show was over. The punishment would begin. He didn't pick up the bag. Instead, he turned and walked back to the dead tree. He placed his claws on the branches, and a shudder ran through the dry wood. Then he began to sing. It wasn't music. It was a guttural mantra, a series of harsh, ancient syllables that didn't belong to any human language. Kor, Vith, Azrath, Connect. While he was singing, the house began to change. The walls were now weeping black sap in multiple spots. The wallpaper peeled off, revealing a damp, dark plaster underneath that pulsed rhythmically. The furniture began to wither. The velvet sofa, its bright color fading into a musty gray. The wood of the coffee table cracked and groaned as if in pain. But the greatest transformation was in the tree itself. Under Krampus's touch and chanting, the bare, brown branches began to swell. New buds sprouted, but they weren't green needles. They were thin, pale, and writhed like fingers. And from these buds, flowers bloomed. They were pale, waxy flowers with dark centers, and they opened and closed to the rhythm of the chanting, exhaling a heavy, sickly scent of rotten honey and old spices. The Christmas tree was being reborn, but as a grotesque parody of itself, a living, sickly thing in the heart of the room. Krampus stopped singing. He plucked one of the flowers and crushed it in his claw. A dark, sticky juice dripped between his fingers. He turned to them, his gaze possessive. He wasn't just visiting anymore. He was putting down roots. He walked to the frosted window and ran a claw across the ice. The ice didn't melt. It darkened, becoming opaque like obsidian. Then he blew on the surface. Complex patterns began to form on the dark glass. Not snowflakes, but symbols of imprisonment. Endless spirals, intricate Celtic knots, and, repeatedly, the word necked. He was sealing the house, turning it into his domain, into his dwelling. He moved around the room, his touch a curse. He ran his fingers across the TV screen, and it darkened. The surface now covered in a thin layer of black moss. He stopped before the fake fireplace, looked at the wooden figure trapped behind the glass, and let out a grunt of approval. He touched the glass and it transformed into a grid of solid ice, locking the artifact away forever. Finally, he stopped before them again. His gaze swept over Mark, who was still on his knees, and Sarah, who was trembling but remained standing. He no longer seemed interested in taking them into his sack. Not yet. He wanted them to witness it. To see their Christmas world systematically dismantled and reassembled in their own twisted image. To know there was no escape. He leaned in, his icy breath forming a cloud around their faces. He extended a claw and, with the sharp point, gently touched Lily's Christmas stocking on the fireplace. The stocking, a red and white knit with her name on it, instantly rotted, the yarn unraveling and darkening, until it became a moldy black rag that fell to the floor. Then he turned and, without haste, walked back to the kitchen, his leather bag dragging behind him with a damp sound. Darkness swallowed him. He was gone, but his presence remained, ingrained in every surface, in the air, in their minds. The flowering tree whispered softly, its waxy petals rubbing against one another. The walls breathed with a damp, panting sound. They were no longer locked outside the nightmare. They were locked inside it. The house was no longer a refuge. It was the skin of the devil himself, and they were living in its entrails. Lily, who had been incredibly quiet, finally spoke, her terrified whisper summarizing the new horror. "Mom," she said, pointing to the pale, wrinkled flowers on the tree. What is he growing? The house breathed. It was a tenderness now, as undeniable as the cold. A slow, damp rhythm emanated from the walls, an almost imperceptible expansion and contraction that made the wallpaper crackle and the dark sap seep in pulsating veins. The scent of the tree's waxy flowers had permeated everything. A sweet and fetid odor of necropolis and tomb spices that entered. Sarah and Lily had crawled to the farthest corner of the room, away from the monstrous tree and the kitchen door. They huddled under a blanket, but their body heat couldn't penetrate the cold emanating from within. The frost mark on Mark's cheek ached with a deep, throbbing pain, like a broken bone exposed to ice. Krampus had not returned to the room, but his presence was constant. Sounds came from the kitchen, the dragging of the sack, the occasional tinkling of bells, and once a long, slow, damp creak, like that of a tree being twisted and broken. "What is he doing there?" Sarah whispered, her eyes fixed on the darkness of the kitchen. "I don't want to know," Mark replied, his voice hoarse. He still felt the burning shame of his futile attack, of the cowardice that had flashed through his mind. He looked at Sarah, at the terrified determination on her face, and a new emotion, beyond fear, began to sprout, a humiliated respect. It was Lily who broke the vicious cycle of terror. She stirred under the blanket and pulled something from under the cushion where they were sitting. It was an old, dusty book, bound in faded leather. "I found this hidden behind a loose brick in the fireplace when you were trying to break the window," she whispered. It was hidden. It was a diary. The cover was worn, but the gold lettering was still legible. Isaiah Knecht, 1822. Knecht. The word from the grave. From the wooden figure. With trembling fingers, Sarah picked up the diary and opened it. The handwriting was thick and angular, stained by dampness and time. She read in a low voice, her voice faltering as the words unfolded the horrifying truth. December 20th, 1822. The harvest has failed. The winter is cruel. The children are weak. We hear sounds in the forest, not of wolves, but of something that walks upright and drags chains of ice. The natives avoid these lands. They speak of an old man of ice who comes when families are torn apart by hunger and despair. December 24th, 1822. Little Anna did not survive. My wife, Eleanor, no longer speaks. She only stares at the fire. Despair is a third person in our cabin. Tonight he came, a tall shadow with horns of dry branch. He stopped outside the door and called our name. His voice was the sound of the lake freezing. He offered a pact. He would spare our eldest daughter Eliza from starvation. In return, he demanded a home, a point of anchorage, something to tie him to this land so he would no longer have to wander hungry. I agreed. Anything to save Eliza. Using the methods the shaman Abenaki taught me before he called me crazy, I bound him. I drew his spirit to an object of familiar pain, a symbol of the bond he came to break. I used the pine tree we planted at the birth of Anna, the daughter we lost. The tree of life, now an anchor to death. I bound him, I knechtai him. But he laughed. He said that every anchor can rust, that every family can break apart, and that when it does, he will break free, stronger than ever, and the debt will be paid in blood and soul. Sarah turned the page. The handwriting became frantic, stained with what looked like old blood. He is imprisoned, but he does not sleep. He whispers through the needles of the tree. The house is his prison, but also his fortress. I placed the symbol of his imprisonment, the word Knecht, carved into the wood of the tree that became his body on Anna's grave, to warn those who would come after. May God forgive me. What have I done? The diary ended abruptly. They sat in silence, the weight of history crushing them. It wasn't a random curse. It was a pact, a debt. And they, a broken family, had broken the shackles of Isaiah Knecht. The tree, Mark whispered, staring at the flourishing abomination in the corner of the room. This isn't the same tree, is it? Is it? Is it the same? He's not a visitor, Sarah said, her voice a thread of horror. He's the landlord, and we're the tenants. That's when the gifts started arriving. A soft sound rolled across the wooden floor. A Christmas ornament, intact, rolled out of the dark kitchen and stopped at Lily's feet. It was beautiful, a cobalt blue glass orb with silver snowflakes painted inside. Lily, mesmerized, reached out her hand. "Don't touch!" Sarah shouted, slapping her daughter's hand. The ball shattered on the floor, not into pieces, but in a flurry of tiny, white human teeth that scattered across the carpet like ominous grains of rice. From inside the kitchen, a guttural sound of approval echoed. Other gifts followed. A small box wrapped in gold paper slid out of the darkness. When Mark kicked it, it opened, revealing a tangle of rusty barbed wire twisted into the shape of a wreath. A teddy bear, similar to Lily's but with its eyes gouged out and its sawdust stuffing replaced with rotten olive pits, was tossed into the center of the room. They were perverted tropes. Christmas presents, corrupted into trophies of torture. Krampus was recalling the pact, the exchange. He had received his first gift. Now he was giving his. Hunger and thirst had become too much to bear. Driven mad by thirst, Mark crawled toward the kitchen, keeping away from the door. Perhaps there was water in the tap. Perhaps he could grab something, anything from the shelves. He peeked into the doorway. The kitchen was unrecognizable. The walls were covered in a black, pulsating fungus that shimmered softly. The sink was clogged with a thick red mass that resembled meat jelly. But on the countertop, next to a cutting board stained with a dark substance, was a white porcelain bowl. Inside it was clean, crystal-clear water. It was bait. He knew it, but his throat was a desert of sand and pain. He looked back at Sarah, who was shaking her head desperately. He looked at the water. The survival instinct was stronger. He dragged himself into the kitchen, his heart pounding in his throat. The air was heavy with the smell of raw meat and earth. He reached the counter, his fingers closing around the bowl. The water looked so pure. He brought it to his lips and drank. It was cold. It was water. For a second, it was the sweetest relief he had ever experienced. Then the taste arrived. Metallic, salty, the familiar taste of blood. He spat, choking, dropping the bowl on the floor. It shattered, and the remaining water sprayed in a vivid red arc against the black mold on the wall. It wasn't water. It was blood. Pure blood. From inside the locked pantry, a deep, hoarse sound of contentment echoed. Krampus was there. He had been watching. Mark crawled back into the room, vomiting bile, the taste of scrap metal poisoning his mouth. He looked at Sarah and Lily, their pale, hungry faces, and knew they wouldn't last much longer. The house wouldn't kill them from hunger or thirst. It would lead them to poison themselves, to accept the host's gifts. It was then that Lily, weak and trembling, pointed to the corner of the ceiling where a garland of holly had been hung. The berries, once a bright red, were now black and swollen. "She's crying," Lily whispered. She was right. From the black holly berries, a dark, thick liquid oozed in slow, heavy drops, dripping onto the carpet below. It wasn't sap. It was blood. Fresh blood. The house wasn't just breathing. It was bleeding, and the blood on the holly, the symbol of life and protection in winter, meant one thing. The corruption was complete. Krampus's dwelling was alive, and its cycle of nourishment had begun. They were no longer just prisoners. They were the food. Blood trickled from the holly in thin, dark threads, painting the floor with an irregular dripping pattern. The sound, plink, 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 was a macabre metronome for their agony. The taste of blood in Mark's mouth was a profanation, a forced communion with the living house. Hunger and thirst were now secondary. The primary imperative was to escape the slow digestion of this entity. Isaiah Connect's diary weighed like a tombstone in Sarah's hands. It wasn't just a story, it was a flawed survival manual. "He's trapped in the tree," she whispered, her words escaping like smoke in the icy air. "The tree is the anchor. It always has been." Mark looked up, his bloodshot eyes fixed on the flourishing monstrosity in the corner. Its pale, finger-like branches writhed gently, and the waxen flowers whispered to each other in voices like dry leaves. "So we destroyed it. Now. How?" Sarah asked desperately. "He's protecting her. What if?" What if destroying her only frees him completely? "He's free, Sarah," Mark shouted, his voice broken by exhaustion and suppressed terror. "He's in our kitchen. He's bleeding from our ceiling. What more can he do?" The answer came from Lily. She was huddled together, staring intently at the cellar door. Frost had spread, covering the entire door and the surrounding wall with an intricate and aggressive pattern of ice. "He's calling," she whispered. From down there, she was right. A new sound emanated from the cellar, passing through the frozen door. It wasn't the dragging of the sack or the tinkling of bells. It was a low, reverberating chant. The same guttural singing that Krampus had used to transform the tree, but now coming from multiple voices. Young voices. Children's voices, distorted by ice and time, singing an ancient and forgotten lullaby about eternal sleep in winter. It was terrifying. It was a final perversion of comfort. "He has other children down there," Sarah said, her voice a groan of horror. "In the sack. He collects them." The revelation gave Mark a focused and desperate purpose. The tree. It had to be the tree. It was the only thing that made sense. He stood up, his aching body protesting. He had no axe, no gasoline. All he had was anger and a candlestick. "Mark, wait," Sarah pleaded. But he was already moving, stumbling toward the corrupted tree. The whispers of the flowers intensified as he approached, becoming a frantic buzzing of enraged insects. The sweet, rotten scent became oppressive. He raised the candelabra. "Go away!" He shouted at the tree, at the house, at the thing in the kitchen. He struck the main trunk. The wood didn't crack. She screamed, a sharp, soul-crushing sound, like that of a young animal being stabbed, emanated from the point of impact. The trunk didn't splinter, it bled. A dark red liquid gushed from the wound, splashing onto Mark's face and hands. It was hot and vivid. The entire tree trembled violently. The finger-like branches twisted and stretched toward him. One of the wax flowers suddenly opened and spewed a jet of the same black, sticky sap. It struck Mark's arm and a sharp, burning pain pierced it as if acid had been injected into his vein. He screamed and recoiled, dropping the candelabra. The entire room reacted. The ceiling lights, which had been off for days, flickered once with a sickly yellow light, then shattered, raining glass down on them. The holly sap began to drip faster, forming a dark puddle on the carpet. From the walls, black sap gushed as if the house's veins had been severed. And then, from the kitchen, came the sound. The tinkling of bells. Slow, deliberate. Schlump. Tinkling. Schlump. He was coming. Sarah ran to Mark, pulling him away from the tree that was now weeping blood. They retreated to their corner, clutching Lily. There was nowhere to run. Krampus emerged from the kitchen. He seemed larger, more substantial, as if the pain of the tree had nourished him. His coal-black eyes gleamed with a silent fury. In one of his claws, he held not the bag, but a long, thin metallic object, a hearth tool, a skewer. Now, rusty and stained, he ignored Mark and Sarah. His gaze was fixed on Lily. He took a step. "Schlump? Stay away from her," Sarah growled, pulling Lily back. He took another step. The children singing in the cellar grew louder, more urgent, a cacophony of hungry, frozen voices. He was only 3 meters away now. The smell of rot and ice was suffocating. He extended his empty claw toward Lily, his branch-like fingers opening and closing. That's when Sarah saw it. Hanging from Krampus' belt, among the bells and bones, was a small, silvery, tarnished baby rattle. And on it, engraved, was the name Anna, Isaiah Knecht's daughter. The first one he tried to save. She understood. He wasn't just collecting children. He was collecting the pain of losing children. That's what fueled him. That's what strengthened him. He took the final step, his shadow looming over Lily, and Mark, driven by a last, desperate instinct, did not attack the creature. He turned, and with a scream that tore from his throat, he plunged his hands into the bloody, screaming branches of the tree. Sarah, now. He wasn't trying to destroy her. He was trying to hold on to her. His fingers sank into the soft, pulsating wood. The pain was excruciating. A burning frost and a freezing fire simultaneously. The tree howled, and Krampus froze in place, a spasm coursing through his body. a scream of pure rage, not from the guttural chant, but from 100 overlapping voices. Men, women, children roared from the cleft of his mouth. The anchor was being violated. "Lily, the diary!" Sarah shouted, seizing the opportunity. She tossed the old diary to her daughter. "The last page. Say the words." Lily, trembling violently, picked up the diary. Her small hands tore at the final pages. There, scribbled on the back cover, was not Isaiah's handwriting, but a single symbol, a complex, closed knot, and below it, a phrase in Latin. In a clear, trembling voice, rising above the howl of the tree and the roar of the creature, Lily read, "I untie the bonds. I break the bond. I remake the bonds. I break the connection." Krampus staggered backward as if he had been struck in the chest. The bells on his belt jingled frantically. The darkness in his coal-black eyes wavered. But then he recovered. The tree was too strong, the connection too deep. A child's simple breaking spell wasn't enough. He let out a low growl and stood up again, angrier than ever. He raised the rusty skewer, its point aimed at Mark's heart, who was still immobilized, his hands trapped in the screaming tree. Hope died in Sarah's eyes. That's when Lily, seeing that words weren't enough, did the only thing left. She ran to the tree, ignoring the writhing branches and the gushing blood. She didn't try to tear her father away. Instead, she placed her small hands over his on the bloodied bark, and she began to sing. It wasn't a Latin spell. It was the song Mark used to sing to her at bedtime, long before the divorce, when nights are safe and parents are invincible. His voice was weak, out of tune with fear, but it was pure. It was a sound of unconditional love in a place where only hatred and pain should exist. "Starlight, star bright, first star I see tonight." Krampus stopped. The spit was still raised, but he didn't move. The roars in his mouth diminished to a confused hiss. The singing voices in the cellar wavered. "I wish I may, I wish I might, have the wish I wish tonight." The wax flowers on the tree began to wither, their pale petals shrinking and turning brown. The blood gushing from the trunk dwindled to a trickle. The branches holding Mark relaxed slightly. Lily was doing what Isaiah Connect couldn't do, what her parents couldn't do. She wasn't breaking the anchor, she was reconnecting to it. She was reminding the tree, and the thing that was stuck to it, of what it meant to be a family, of a bond that wasn't based on fear or debt, but on love. And for a brief, fragile moment, it seemed like it might work. Then Krampus roared, a sound of pure, vile, ancient envy. The spear went down. The rusty spear descended in a silent, deadly arc. It wasn't a stroke of blind rage, but a calculated execution. It all happened in the blink of an eye. Sarah screamed, a hoarse, heart-rending sound. Lily froze, her song dying on her lips. Mark, with a final burst of strength, tried to dodge, but his hands were still partially fused to the bloody, weeping bark of the tree. The movement was minimal. The tip of the skewer didn't strike his heart. It pierced his shoulder, tearing flesh and muscle with a wet, horrific sound. Mark's cry wasn't one of immediate pain, but of surprise. A hoarse, animalistic whine that was drowned out by Krampus's triumphant roar. The pain came an instant later, an explosion of white fire that blurred his vision. He felt the creature's claws closing in on his coat, tearing him from the tree. The agony was indescribable as the twisted iron moved inside his flesh. He was thrown across the room like a rag, hitting the opposite wall and collapsing in a heap of pain and disorientation. The world became a pulsating fog of red and black. He could hear Sarah and Lily screaming, but the sounds seemed to come from far away. Krampus didn't give Mark a second glance. The threat had been neutralized. He turned, his attention now fully focused on the small figure who had dared to defy his nature with a simple lullaby. The envy he exuded was a physical chill, making the air tremble. Lily recoiled, but not fast enough. The claw that wasn't holding the bloodied skewer closed around her arm. The touch wasn't of burning ice, but of an absolute vacuum that sucked away all warmth, all hope. She screamed, a sharp sound of pure terror as he pulled her closer. "Lily!" "No!" Sarah lunged forward, blinded by a maternal instinct that overcame all fear. She grabbed Krampos's moss-covered fur-like cloak, trying to pull it back. Her hands found a surface that was both slippery and rough, and so cold that her skin stuck and tore. Krampus simply ignored her. With a disdainful movement of his free arm, he shoved her away. It wasn't a violent blow, but an absolute rejection. Sarah was thrown backward, feeling as if all the air had been expelled from her lungs. She fell on her back, her head hitting the ground with a dull thud that sent dancing stars before her eyes. Stunned, she watched Krampus drag Lily, who was struggling and screaming, towards the center of the room. He let her go. She fell to her knees, crying, clutching her arm where the mark of 5 black, icy fingers was already forming on her pale skin. He stood over her, a mountain of darkness and despair. Then he picked up the leather bag he had left on the ground. He lifted it, and the opening, which had previously seemed sewn shut, opened like a wet, gasping mouth. It was time to collect his debt. Sarah tried to stand, but her body wouldn't respond. Her vision was blurry, her legs felt like jelly. "Please," she cried, her voice a broken whisper. "Please, take me instead." Krampus didn't even look at her. His coal-black eyes were fixed on Lily. The bag swung forward. It was then that Mark, on the verge of unconsciousness, acted. The pain in his shoulder was like a furnace. But the sight of his daughter about to be taken incinerated everything except one thought. He couldn't fight. He couldn't run. But he could put himself in the way. With a groan that was half agony, half determination, he crawled across the floor. Each movement was a stab, a flame of pain that tore tears from his eyes. He crawled, leaving a vivid red trail on the dark carpet, placing himself between Lily and the falling bag. The bag, heavy and alive, landed on him. It was like being swallowed by a damp, pulsating void. The world vanished. The air disappeared. There was only a suffocating smell of grave earth and ancient flesh, and an unimaginable weight. Not physical, but spiritual. It was the weight of all the children who had been taken before, their despair, their fear, their ultimate loneliness, all compressed into an oppressive darkness. He felt small, ghostly hands tugging at his clothes, tiny, frozen voices whispering in his ears, telling their sad, endless stories. He was drowning in a sea of lost innocence. Krampus stood still for a moment, the opening of the bag now closed over Mark's torso. He seemed considered. He didn't want the father. He wanted the daughter, whose pure love was a more dangerous antidote to his nature than any axe. But a father sacrificing himself for his daughter, that too had a flavor. It was a different kind of pain, a more complex and mature despair. Still, nourishing with a tug. He began dragging Mark, still partially in the sack, toward the cellar. Sarah watched, paralyzed, as the creature dragged her ex-husband, the man she had blamed for so long, across the floor. He was no longer conscious. His body was an inert burden, his blood painting a path toward the cold door. "Mark," she whispered, the name coming out like a funeral prayer. The cellar door slid open on its own with a creak, revealing utter darkness and the icy corner of the children inside. Krampus and his prize vanished into the darkness, and the door slammed shut behind them with a final bang. The sound of the singing stopped. The room fell silent, except for Lily's gasping sobs and Sarah's panting breath. He's gone. Mark is gone. And the weight that lingered in the room, hanging over Sarah and Lily, wasn't one of relief. It was the weight of the bag, the knowledge of what had happened, the knowledge that Mark had chosen, and the terrifying knowledge that, for Krampus, this wasn't an end. It was just a postponement. The daughter was still here. The unhappiness, now tempered with guilt and loss, was deeper than ever, and the tree in the corner stopped weeping blood. Its withered flowers fell, and a new bud, pale and sickly, began to grow on one of its branches. It was a tiny, perfect black rose of ice. Krampus was renewing himself, and he hadn't given up on Lily. He was just feeding first on his father's despair. The silence after the cellar door closed was the sound of their world collapsing. Sarah lay on the floor, her head throbbing, the taste of copper and defeat in her mouth. Mark's trail of blood led to the cold door like a severed umbilical cord, connecting her to a reality she could no longer reach. He was gone. The word echoed in the emptiness of her mind. Gone. Gone. Lily wept silently, curled up on the floor, hugging the arm where the black mark of 5 fingers now seemed carved into her flesh, a tattoo of ice and darkness. The rotten teddy bear Krampus had left behind was inches from her face, its empty eyes staring at her. The corrupted tree no longer whispered. It emanated a satisfied stillness, a deep vegetal contentment. The black, icy rose on its branch glowed softly in the spectral candlelight, its wicked beauty a declaration of victory. The house breathed slowly, the walls pulsing like a full stomach. Sarah forced herself to sit up. The pain in her head was a fog, but the pain in her chest was a knife. She looked at her daughter, at the small figure trembling on the cold floor, and something inside her solidified. Despair no longer had a place. It had been consumed, along with Mark. All that remained was a cold, determined core of fury. She was no longer Sarah, the resentful wife. She was Sarah, the mother, and she would not allow this house to take anything more from her. "Lily," she said, her voice hoarse but firm. Lily lifted her face, which was flooded with tears. "He won't take you," Sarah said, each word a promise carved in steel. "Did you hear?" Lily nodded, a small, trembling movement of her head. Sarah crawled over to her, ignoring the pain, and pulled her into a hug. Lily's body was cold. "We're going to get out of here. We're going to burn this house to the ground. But how?" They were locked up, unarmed, powerless. Mark had tried force and failed. Lily had tried innocence and failed. The diary. Isaiah Knecht's diary was still open on the floor near where Lily had been. Sarah picked it up. Its pages seemed more fragile, as if the story itself were disintegrating. She reread the final entries about the anchor, the pact, the symbol. I placed the symbol of his imprisonment, the word Knecht, carved into the wood of the tree that became his body. She looked at the tree. The word was no longer visible. It had been carved 200 years ago. It had been absorbed like everything else. But then, her mind, sharpened by the crisis, made a connection. The wooden figure, the small statue that came with the first gift. It was still locked behind the frosted glass of the fake fireplace. Sarah turned and looked at it. The figure of a screaming man, with the word Knecht scratched into its base. It wasn't just a warning. It was a key, a replica, a focal point. "Lily," Sarah whispered, her eyes fixed on the statue. "The pact. Isaiah Knecht bound Krampus to the tree. The tree is his body. But the figure is the symbol of the prison." She remembered what old Tom Harrison had said in the shop. Knecht is a warning. It means tied or bound. She didn't need to destroy the tree. She needed to remake the bonds, to reaffirm the prison, and to do that, she needed the symbol. But the fireplace was sealed with a layer of solid, impenetrable ice. She looked at the candles around her. The fire. Fire was the antithesis of ice, of stagnation, of decay. It was the only thing the house seemed to fear. "We need to melt the ice," she told Lily. "We need to get to that figure." They gathered all the candles they could find. There were perhaps a dozen of various sizes. Sarah picked them up, her hands trembling not with fear, but with fierce anticipation. She carried them to the false fireplace. The glass was opaque and black, but the ice behind it was as thick as stone. She began pushing the candles against the icy surface, clustering them in the frame. The flame danced and crackled, gasping against the intense cold emanating from the glass. The ice wouldn't melt, it hissed. A black, foul vapor rose where the flames touched, and a subtle sound of anguish ran through the house. A groan in the beams. Lily joined her, holding their candles, her little shadow dancing on the wall behind them. Mother and daughter, united not by grief, but by purpose. The ice began to recede, agonizingly inch by inch. The surface of the dark glass became visible, and behind it, the wooden figure. It seemed to vibrate, not with fear, but with expectation. That's when the house retaliated. The cellar door burst open. It wasn't opened. It was shattered, broken into 1,000 fragments of wood and ice that flew across the room. From the dark opening, Krampus emerged, but he was no longer the tall, imposing figure. He crawled, his body distorted and swollen, as if he had digested a meal that was too large. His fur cloak was torn, and beneath it, a pulsating, pale mass resembling damp wood and flesh could be seen. His face was even further sunken into darkness, but his coal-black eyes gleamed with a feverish, insane light. He dragged the sack behind him, which now seemed heavy and inert. He was in a hurry. He sensed the threat. He roared, a sound that was no longer that of many voices, but of the house itself creaking down to its foundations, and he crawled towards them with surprising speed. "Lily, continue," Sarah shouted, turning to face the creature. She had no weapon. She had no strength. All she had was her body. She threw herself at Krampus, striking, kicking, scratching his icy, bony surface. It was like attacking a mountain. Her hands bled, her fists ached. He pushed her aside with a flick of his arm, and she flew across the room, crashing into a tree. Dry branches cracked under her weight. He wasn't interested in her. His goal was Lily and the candles. Lily, trembling, held her position, gripping 2 candles against the melting ice. She didn't look back. She could feel the creature's icy breath on her neck, the frantic tinkling of the bells. The ice in front of the figure cracked with a loud snap. Krampus extended a claw to grab her. Sarah, bloodied and dizzy, saw her chance. She didn't attack the creature. She threw herself to the ground, straight into the skin sack it was dragging. She shoved her hands into the damp, panting opening. Inside, she felt something solid and cold. The fireplace tool. The skewer that had pierced Mark. She pulled him with all her might. Krampus screamed, a sound of genuine surprise and anger, and turned to her, his claw dodging Lily at the last second. Sarah, on her knees, held the bloodied skewer with both hands. She didn't aim it at the creature. She raised it, and with a scream that came from the depths of her soul, she plunged it into the wooden floor, directly into the center of the word, "Thank you," that Krampus had burned there. It wasn't a physical blow. It was a symbolic act. She was piercing the heart of the pact, rejecting the gift he had given them. The whole house trembled. A howl of agony echoed through every plank, every nail. Krampus staggered, a jet of black, icy substance gushing from where the spike had metaphorically pierced him. And at that very moment, Lily, with one last effort, broke the weakened glass of the fireplace and retrieved the wooden figure necked. She turned and, looking into the coal-black eyes of the writhing creature, she didn't read a spell. She simply held the figure aloft like a lantern against the darkness and screamed with all the strength of her lungs. "You can't have her. This is our home." The figure in Lily's hand began to glow with a warm, white light. The word "necked" shimmered like fire. Krampus froze in place. The light from the figure reflected in his coal-black eyes, not like a reflection, but like a fire. He began to writhe, his body contracting, being pulled back toward the tree. He wasn't being destroyed. He was being gathered back. The anchor was reasserting itself, the symbol of the prison pulling the prisoner back into his cell. The tree screamed, a sound of wood cracking and breaking. The black rose of ice shattered. The branches twisted, enveloping Krampus's retreating form, pulling him into the trunk. With a final roar of impotent fury that gradually faded into the whisper of a winter breeze, Krampus was swallowed back into the tree. Silence fell. The tree was still, just a dead, burnt Christmas tree, its branches black and broken. The house stopped breathing. The sap in the walls dried up. The blood on the holly stopped dripping. The pale, fragile light of dawn penetrated the windows for the first time. The ice that covered them began to melt, trickling down like tears. Sarah and Lily stood amidst the devastation, breathless, enveloped in an almost sacred silence. The stake was still embedded in the ground. The wooden figure in Lily's hand was now cold and inert. The word necked faded, as if its task were complete. He was gone. Contained. Not destroyed, but asleep once more. But when Sarah looked at the dead tree, she swore she could see, deep within the cracked trunk, a pair of tiny distant points of charcoal still glowing with ancient hatred. The battle was over. The war, they knew, was not. The first ray of true sunlight piercing through the unobstructed window seemed like a miracle. It brought no warmth but a stark clarity that illuminated the devastation in the room. Dust danced in the beams of light, hovering over the destroyed furniture, the carpet stained with blood and sap, and the charred remains of the Christmas tree. The air still smelled of decay and smoke, but the oppressive weight, the conscious presence, had dissipated. The house was dead, or perhaps merely asleep. Sarah stood there for a long time, just breathing. Each breath was a knife in her bruised ribs, but it was also an affirmation. She was alive. Lily was alive. She looked at her daughter, who still held the wooden necked figure with a tear-off, white-knuckled grip, her face pale and blotchy, but her eyes dry. There was a new age in them, a dark depth that no child should have. "Is he gone?" Lily whispered, her voice hoarse. "For now," Sarah replied, her own voice a rough rustle. She wouldn't lie to her. Ever again, they moved like sleepwalkers. The front door now opened with the simple turn of the handle, the metal cold but not sealed. The sharp, pure outside air flooded the entrance, a stark contrast to the stale air inside that they both coughed. The snow on the porch was immaculate, without hoofprints. The world outside had continued, ignorantly normal. The first thing they did was go to the garage. The door slid open with a groan, but it worked. Their car was there. Sarah found an old cell phone in the glove compartment with a little battery left. Her first call was to the fire department. Her second call, trembling, was to the police, to report a missing man, Mark Hargrove, possibly, she swallowed hard, possibly trapped in the basement. They waited outside, wrapped in blankets they'd taken from the car, watching the authorities arrive. The house appeared deceptively peaceful in daylight. No one could have imagined the hell those walls had contained. The firefighters forced open the cellar door. There was no sign of Mark. The cellar was empty, except for a lingering smell of damp earth and a stubborn frost that refused to melt in a dark corner. The spike Sarah had stuck in the living room floor was treated as evidence, a sinister artifact from a night of terror. The police listened to her story with expressions of skepticism masked as professionalism. A domestic dispute that got out of control? Hallucinations from carbon monoxide poisoning. They found high levels, explaining the flickering lights, the strange sounds. It was the convenient explanation everyone wanted to believe. Sarah and Lily didn't argue. They had the same story, told with a terrifying calm and details too specific to be invented, but without physical proof, without a body, it was just a story. The wooden figure Knecht had disappeared. Lily swore she'd left it on the mantelpiece, but when she turned around, it was gone. They were taken to a hotel. In the days that followed under the pale winter sun, the facade of normality began to rebuild itself. But it was a fragile facade, like thin ice on a black lake. Sarah dreamed of the sound of bells and the smell of rotten honey. She would wake up screaming, feeling icy claws on her arms. Lily didn't talk much. She drew. Her notebooks filled with sketches of a tall figure with horns, of trees with branches like fingers, and the word necked written repeatedly in the margins. Sometimes Sarah would catch her staring into empty space, whispering to someone, or something, that only she could hear. They never returned home. It was put up for sale, an advertisement describing it as a rare lakeside opportunity, perfect for creating Christmas memories. Sarah laughed, a dry, bitter sound whenever she saw it. A month later, on what would have been Mark's birthday, Sarah received a package. There was no return address. Inside, in a plain cardboard box, was Lily's teddy bear. Not Krampos's rotten teddy bear, but the real one. The one she had left behind in the house. It smelled of lavender and softness as always. Wrapped around its neck was a small piece of dark red wrapping paper. It was a message. A reminder. I still have things of yours. I'm still here. Sarah burned the teddy bear and the paper in the hotel frying pan, watching the flames consume the last relic of her former life. She didn't cry. The source of her tears had dried up, frozen that night. They moved to the other side of the country, to an apartment in a noisy city where Christmas was an explosion of light and consumerism, not a season of quiet and darkness. Lily started at a new school. Sarah found a job. They never talked about Pinehaven. They never talked about Mark. It was a sealed grave between them. But on certain quiet nights, when the wind howled in a certain way, or when the flashing city lights reflected off the snow in a park, Sarah would see Lily stop and stand still, her head slightly tilted as if listening to a distant sound, a tinkling, a dragging, and Sarah knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that Krampus wasn't contained within that house. The house was merely a vessel. The true anchor, they had discovered too late, wasn't the tree. It was the Knecht family itself, the lineage of misfortune, and they Hargroves had become its newest branches. She looked at her daughter, at the darkness that now lived behind her eyes, and wondered if Mark, wherever he was, in the sack or melted into the icy darkness, had truly failed. Perhaps his sacrifice hadn't saved them. Perhaps it had only marked them as her own. The demon that wore Santa Claus' face had not been defeated. He had simply found his new home, not in a house by a lake, but in the broken quiet between a mother and daughter, in the space where love was now tempered with an eternal, watchful fear. And he could wait. Winter, after all, always returns, and somewhere, far, far away, a lonely bell rang, just once, promising that its final gift had not yet been delivered.